What's up guys, Ancient here again with another build video, and today we're going over the Warden tank. So the Warden tank is still considered to be one of the better classes as a tank. They have a fairly decent self-heal now. Their burst heal has been buffed a little bit incrementally, patch by patch, so it's actually pretty decent. They have a native source of stamina return that does restore stamina while you're blocking. The only kind of downside with Warden tanks, at least compared to DK tanks, is they don't bring any sort of passive buffs that really increase the DPS. So DK tanks get Divine Brutality along with the debuff from Engulfing Flames. Warden tanks don't really offer that much in terms of DPS boosts. They get minor toughness, which is always useful for survivability, but it doesn't directly increase DPS. And so Warden tanks, while they definitely have a very powerful toolkit when it comes to tanking, as well as pretty varied toolkits, they don't really quite beat out DKs in terms of the quote best tanking class. That being said though, because of the Warden's toolsets, they're actually very good as heal tanks, and they still really do succeed very well in tanks as tanks in general. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. Now, as a support role, you will need to have access to a lot of different sets, and it'll have access to a lot of different skills. So we will be discussing each of these sets in turn, as well as each of these skills in turn, kind of explaining why you use them, where you use them, etc., etc. From there, because we're a support role, we don't have a DPS parse. Instead, we'll be talking about each of the kind of philosophies behind tanking, and kind of discuss a little bit as to what you should be doing as a Warden tank and just as a tank in general. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So again, this is just one of many different possible gear combinations, and we will be going over each of the sets in turn so you guys know when and where to use them. So starting off with monster helm sets, you have a lot of different monster helm sets you could run. Starting off here first with Lord Warden. This is a classic tanking set here that is both selfish and group oriented at the same time. You get a lot of resistances from Lord Warden on yourself, plus you get the 38 to 70 resistances to other allies within 8 meters of you. So pretty useful, especially in those stack and burn fights where you're able to help mitigate some damage by having Lord Warden. This does come from Imperial City Prison, so you do need to have access to the Imperial City DLC to get this set. Moving on to other monster helms, there's quite a long list of monster helm sets that you're going to want to hold on to as a tank. We're just going to go straight down the list here. Starting things off here first with, let's see who's going to be first. You don't really need the Swarm Mother as a Warden tank. You have access to both the Warden pull skill, which is Frozen Portal, plus you also have access to Silver Leash as sort of an immediate sort of pull if you need it. So Swarm Mother, not really all that great. Earthgore, this is the first one we're going to be talking about here. So Earthgore is a monster helm set that comes from Bloodroot Forge. A very strong burst heal set. Activates every 35 seconds though. So not really useful in all scenarios. It's going to be most useful in those instances where you need that burst heal, and you think you'll only need it like every 35 seconds. A good example of where Earthgore really shines is going to be like in Cloud Rest. If you're a portal tank, it really helps out down there in the portals because you don't, typically speaking, will not be going down with a healer. But other than that, Earthgore is not really a set that I would necessarily advocate for on a tank. Moving on from there, we have, let's see here, Bloodspawn, which is probably going to be the only monster helm set in the base game that you can pick up as a tank outside of running 2 Magicka regen monster helm pieces. Bloodspawn's going to be used more for the ultimate generation. This basically reduces the time between your Warhorn casts, which basically increases the uptime for Major Force, which is a direct increase to overall DPS. You do get some physical and spell resistance, but you're not going to be wearing Bloodspawn for that, mainly because the proc chance and therefore the uptime is going to be fairly low. Moving on from Bloodspawn, you have Thurvokun, which comes from Fang Lair. So whenever you take damage, you create a growing pool of desecrated bile, which deals disease damage. It also inflicts minor maim and minor defile. So Warden tanks do not have a AoE source of minor defile in their toolkit, so if you want to do AoE source of minor defile, Thurvokun would be the best bet to go for. Next is going to be Vykosa, which comes from Moonhunter Keep. Whenever you bash an enemy you've taunted, you frighten them with a deafening howl, applying major maim to them for 3 seconds. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds. So this is particularly strong in those instances where you can anticipate high amounts of damage coming in from the boss. So for example, St. Olms's Firebomb in Execute would be a good example of this. The dragons in Sunspire, their Fire Breath is another good example of when you can use this major maim. Basically reduced incoming damage either to you or to the group. The only other real good source of major maim would be from ultimates, which obviously you're not going to be able to do every 15 seconds. But Vykosa is really strong for progression style groups and just overall survivability. Moving on, you have 2 other sets here. Stonekeeper, which comes from Frostbolt. This is definitely more of a selfish set. So whenever you block an attack, you gain a stack of energy. When you gain 6 stacks, you get 5350 stamina, magicka, and health back. And then you need to wait 14 seconds before you can recharge it. So it's a total of a 20-second cooldown, which ends up working out to be about 250 additional flat regen. So pretty strong overall, really selfish however. And if you're not really able to block attacks, it's not going to be all that useful obviously. Next we have Symphony of Blades, which comes from Depths of Malatar. Ties in very well with Warden tanks because you do have some healing moves that heal everybody around you. So when you heal an ally under 50% of their primary resource, you get 2325. They get, I should say, 2325 of their highest resource every second for 6 seconds. This effect can occur every 18 seconds. So overall, a really strong sustain tool for DPS, healers, and other tanks as well. So definitely a set that you're going to want to pick up here. Next is Grundwolf, which I don't really recommend too highly here, because you do need to deal critical damage in order to get the proc here, and it occurs once every 5 seconds, so not quite as strong. So this would end up being 200 regen, assuming you can proc it on cooldown of probably stamina, which is going to be your higher stat, and 100 regen on magicka. So not particularly great overall because of that proc condition of dealing critical damage. As a tank, your critical hit chance is probably going to be fairly low, so you're probably not going to be able to proc it every 5 seconds. But still a potential set to pick up here. This comes from Moongrave Fane. So those are all the different monster helm sets that you can pick up here. Next, we're going to be talking about our different sets here. So first, we're going to be talking about Ebon Armory, which is still a very useful set for both progression and sort of leaderboard running guilds, which gives 1000 max health base before modifiers to you and up to 11 group members. So really strong. It helps improve survivability, which allows DPS to focus more on dealing more damage. So definitely a very strong set to hold on to. This comes from Crypt of Hearts. Next we have Alkosh, which is still the strongest debuff set in the game, support set for tanks. And this comes from Maw of Lorkhaj. Very powerful. Really not much else needs to be said about Alkosh. It reduces physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit whenever you activate a synergy by 3010, making it, again, one of the strongest support sets in the game right now that a tank can wear. There are going to be some fights where you might see a DPS wear this, but generally speaking, this will be put on a tank, not a DPS. Moving on from there, you do have several other sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. So we're just going to go through all of them, starting off with dungeon sets. There are a handful of dungeon sets that you might want to have on hand. First one we're going to be talking about here, if we can find it, it's going to be Leeching Plate. So this is going to be very useful in trash fights where your main goal is just to stay alive. So whenever you take damage, you have a chance to summon a cloud of poison, which deals poison damage and also heals you for 100% of the damage that you've dealt. So really powerful for heals where you have a lot of trash. So a very good example of where I've run this before would be Black Rose Prison on those trash fights. It really helps get your survivability up while you're trying to learn where all those spawns are, learning how to best deal with all the different fight mechanics and things like that. The next set's going to be Jailer's Tenacity. So whenever you lose 7,000 or more health from a single attack, you gain major vitality for 5 seconds. This is going to be a fairly niche use set. It is obviously a selfish set here. It doesn't really provide any sort of group utility. And so 7,000 health or more is actually more common in newer content than it is in older content. So for example, Cloud Rest for Baneful Mark, that obviously proc Jailer's Tenacity. The dragons in Sunspire, some of their moves do have a chance to proc Jailer's Tenacity. So overall, selfish set, but it is useful in those instances because generally speaking, when you lose that much health, you do want to get it back very quickly, sometimes due to some sort of defile effect. So overall a fairly decent set to hold on to. And then from there you have Dragon's Defilement, which comes from Lair of Marsalok. This is one of the new sets, so whenever you take damage from a melee attack, you gain a Corrupting Aura for 5 seconds that applies Minor Fracture and Minor Breach to all enemies around you. So this is a really powerful set in trash pulls, so you're a poor Templar healer, or if you're running one, a Stamplar, they don't have to run around and power up to light everything. You just have a tank run in there with Dragon's Defilement, and assuming they take melee damage, you will end up getting that Minor Fracture and Minor Breach on everything around you. So a really powerful set for those trash fights. Moving on from dungeon sets, we have trial sets. The only one that I want to talk about is going to be Claw of Yolnahkriin, which comes from Sunspire. This is the only source of minor courage in the game right now, which increases weapon and spell damage by 129 base before any modifiers. This is a really nice set to hold onto here for that minor courage. It actually ends up being about a 3 to 4% increase in DPS depending on what your base weapon and spell damage is. So overall, really strong. Not only is it group oriented, but you also get that minor aegis for some additional survivability. So definitely a set I would recommend farming for. It's not absolutely required, but it is still a very nice DPS bonus with that minor courage. Moving on from heavy trial sets, we do have a handful of overland sets that we can talk about as well once I find where I put. Here it is. In terms of overland sets, the first one is going to be Plague Doctor, which is the epitome of selfish sets. It gives you 3,000 additional max health on the 5-piece, so really great for if you're just trying to learn, just want to get some survivability down while you're learning mechanics. But once you start to learn mechanics, you're going to want to start to shy away from Plague Doctor and focus in more on group utility sets. Moving on from there, you have Akaviri Dragonguard, which comes from Eastmarch. Reduces the cost of your ultimates by 15%. So very similarly to Bloodspawn, it basically reduces the time between your Warhorn casts, which gives you improved major force uptime. So that's kind of the benefit of Akaviri Dragonguard. This is one of my go-to sets when I'm not really sure what other set I should be running. So not as strong as some other DPS boosting sets, but still pretty useful nonetheless. And from there, we have Livewire, which comes from Clockwork City. So whenever you take damage, you have a chance to overload your circuits, applying concussion to enemies within 8 meters of you. So this is pretty decent for trash pulls, because concussion is a requirement for off balance to be applied. So this just basically gives you, your healers at least, a very good chance of applying off balance in a giant group of enemies. So really, really helpful there with Livewire. From there, we also have a couple of light and medium sets that I want to talk about. For a Warden. First one, whoops, not an overland set, it's going to be a dungeon set here. And it is going to be the Worm's Raiment. So this comes from Vault of Madness. Now, as a light armor set, you will want to get jewelry and weapons of the Worm in order to do this. The quest reward for this dungeon is a shield, so you don't necessarily have to worry about getting the shield, but the one-hander and a staff back bar is going to be what you're going to be really struggling for there. So Worm reduces the cost of your Magicka abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other group members. So really great for Magicka-oriented groups, not so strong for Stamina-oriented groups. But there is a set for those Stamina-oriented groups as well. If I can find it, it would be here somewhere. Here it is. And it's going to be Hircine's Veneer. So this reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4% for you and up to 11 other group members. It's basically the stamina version of Worm's Raiment. Now, like Alkosh, this is a medium armor set, so you do need to get the jewelry and weapons. While medium armor tanking is kind of a thing for certain fights, generally speaking, it's not really going to be for everybody. It's going to be mostly for those tanks that are highly experienced and are in those very high-end PvE guilds there. From there, that's pretty much most of the sets that you're going to potentially run. There are a handful of other very niche use sets, for example, Hide of the Werewolf, which gives you ultimate every 5 seconds. But generally speaking, those sets are not going to be quite as strong as the other sets that we've talked about. Continuing to talk about our armor, we have traits and enchants. So there's a couple schools of thoughts here, so I tend to prescribe to running all infused on my large pieces and all sturdy on my small pieces and my shield. I still use prismatic enchants on my large pieces, but I use my small pieces to kind of fine-tune my build. So if I need more stamina, then I'll enchant it with max stamina enchant. Usually my default is just to go for a max magicka enchant, but again, like I said, you can kind of play around with it however you'd like to kind of make it fit what you need. The other sort of option would be to just go all straight sturdy, so you have sturdy across all 3 pieces. Another thing that some people do is they double down on their prismatic enchants and just go all prismatics across all pieces here, kind of go for that really balanced approach there. So that's also an option there if you have the gold to burn on hot cages. For our jewelry, you have a few options when it comes to traits. So I'm personally a fan favorite of Harmony, running at least 1 Harmony for the additional resource return, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You definitely want to get at the very least 1 Triune. Triune's a pretty strong trait. It's basically a prismatic enchant for your jewelry. You can also just go with straight up Arcane, Robust, or Healthy, depending on which resource you feel like you need the most on your tank. And you can also go with the generic Infused, which improves your enchantments. In terms of jewelry enchantments, you really have 2 primary options. The first one is the Shield Plate Enchants, which reduces the cost of block. Second one is going to be Magicka Regen Enchants, so that basically gives you more Magicka Regen. A lot of our abilities do use Magicka, so we do want to make sure we have a healthy pool of Magicka, hence why we go with Magicka Regen there. For your front bar weapon, not that many options here. All of them are pretty poor options. Probably the best one that I can think of would be Decisive, which is basically making the best out of a bad situation. You can also go with Charged if you're running a Shock Enchant on the back bar or the front bar to try to get some better concussed uptimes, but it's kind of up to you whether you want to do that or not. For enchants, again, kind of making the best out of a bad situation because one-handed enchants are half the advertised strength of the glyph. So for example, Absorb Stamina is a good choice, Absorb Health, Hardening, Weakening, Shock Damage if you want to help out with off-balance uptime, with Concussion uptime. Those are all potentially good options there. For our back bar, in terms of the specific weapon you want to use on your back bar, Ice Staves, Lightning Staves, and Lightning Staves and Bows are kind of your options when it comes to two-handed. You could go with a two-handed back bar now that I believe it is Critical Charge now has a AoE dot, so you can proc enchants that way. But generally speaking, Lightning Staff or Ice Staff is going to be the most popular choice. Bow is mostly there for if you want to do some off DPS, and the two-handed is not really all that great, mainly because the actual the actual skills that you get from the two-handed line don't really line up too well with tanks now. So I personally like to go with Ice Staff because you do get some additional damage mitigation with the Ice Staff. You also have the option of using Magicka to block with your Ice Staff rather than Stamina, so if you kind of want to micromanage your resources, you can certainly do that. Some tanks don't like to do that, but that's an option there. In terms of traits to enchants, Infused is definitely going to be the trait that you want to go for. In terms of enchants, I have a Crusher Enchant here, but in some instances, the healer will be running Crusher, in which case you can run a different enchant. So for example, a Shock Enchant to help with concussed uptime, Weakening to reduce the damage that's incoming to the group, Hardening if you want some additional survivability, and so on and so forth. So you do have a lot of flexibility when it comes to traits and enchants on your weapons. Kind of depends on what your raid lead wants. Moving on from all of our gear, let's go ahead and talk about our character sheet now. So I am a Nord. Nords are regarded to be one of the better races for tanking. Generally speaking, race option for tanks are very wide open. Race doesn't have quite as much of an impact on tanking as other factors do. For example, being able to learn mechanics very quickly, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really matter what race you go for. Generally speaking, the best races are going to be Nords, Imperials, or Argonians, mainly due to various factors. So Nords get the health and stamina, they get 2,000 of each, plus they get some ultimate back whenever they take damage, and they get some additional resistances. Imperials also get 2,000 health and stamina. They also get a 3% cost reduction across the board for everything, and they get some health, magicka, and stamina back whenever they take damage every couple of seconds. And Argonians get max health and max magicka, which is still pretty useful. Not quite as much, I believe it's 1,000 across the board for each health and magicka. But they also get some additional healing done, which does affect your self-heals, so it does give you a little bit of stronger self-heals. Plus, they also get 4,000 magicka health and stamina back whenever they drink any potion. So your tri-potions will restore a little over 10,000 resources whenever you drink them. So really, really powerful. And I've seen people combine this with an infused potion cooldown glyph for great effects. Of course, that does mean you're drinking potions much more often, so it does end up being very expensive to do so. But I have seen people use it, so that way they can be a little bit more reckless with their resources. In terms of attributes, your specific attribute distribution is going to vary depending on your race. So for example, those of you guys who follow me on Twitch and watch the streams on YouTube know that when I tank, I am on a Dark Elf tank, so I don't get any sort of max health bonuses from my racial passives. I do get max magicka and max stamina, so the points from magicka and stamina are dumped instead into health, because I do need to make up that lack of a health passive there. Nords, on the other hand, while they do get that health and stamina bonus there, so I have fewer points in that health here, so you can see here I have 16 magicka, 30 health, and 18 stamina. The general rule of thumb is to try to get at least 20k magicka and stamina, and at least 35k max health, across the board no matter what sort of gear combination you're going for. There are some instances where you can be a little bit lower in terms of health, and of course if you're very good at resource management, then you don't need to hit the 20k magicka and stamina, but I highly recommend if you're just starting off tanking to try to hit those numbers, 20, 35, and 20 here. From our Mundus Stone, we're using the Atronach Mundus for our magicka regens, so that way we get more magicka, so we can use more of our skills here. And then in terms of food, we're going with purple food, which gives us health, magicka, and stamina back. There is a food coming out with the Witches Festival, which will give better stats than the current purple tri-stat food, but that's quite a ways away. That's coming out probably in late October, so don't have to worry about that just yet. Moving on to our skill bars. Starting off with our front bar here, we have Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Polar Wind, Bull Netch, Deceptive Predator, and Internal Guardian. For our back bar, so keep in mind I am using an ice staff here, so this bar is mainly for ice and lightning saves. We have Inner Rage, Balance, Unstable Wall of Frost, Gripping Shards, Energy Orb, and Aggressive Warhorn. Now, you do have quite a few flex spots here, so for example, the Deceptive Predator here would be considered a flex spot, as would Gripping Shards and Energy Orbs. And also arguably Unstable Wall of Frost, which actually should be Elemental Blockade. For the longer duration. Now we're just going to go down each little list here to kind of tease out which abilities you're going to want to have on hand and why you'd use them. So starting off with Deceptive Predator, which I mentioned is a flex spot here. Two reasons. First one is for the Major Expedition, which might be useful depending on the fight. So for example, in Cloud Rest, it's always nice if you are tanking Zamaja to be able to move very quickly across the arena as she teleports. But it's mostly for the Minor Evasion, which reduces damage from area of effect attacks by 10%, so it's basically a pretty nice damage mitigation for AoEs. Not quite as strong as Major Evasion, obviously, which gives you 25%, but still pretty useful nonetheless. Under the green balance line, you can use Enchanted Forest or Healing a Thicket as an ultimate heal. Not going to be quite as strong on a tank as it would be on a healer, mainly because your spell and weapon damage is going to end up being lower. So not particularly strong there, but it does help out a little bit here. So 5,000 health is still probably around a quarter of a DPS's health, so that's still a pretty decent heal. It does cost you an ultimate to do so though, so just keep that in mind there. Moving on from there, you have Budding Siege, which might be a decent option. It does heal for quite a bit, and the cost of it is pretty low. Plus, it also has a nice heal over time associated with it as well. So anything that procs off of a heal over time ability, Budding Siege is a good option to hold on to. Under Winter's Embrace line, you can use Ice Fortress if you like instead of Balance for your source of Major Ward and Major Resolve. It also gives it out to people within 8 meters of you. And you also get Minor Protection, which reduces the damage taken by 8%. So pretty decent skill overall, but you do end up giving up balance, so you will need to figure out some other way of getting your resource return. Typically speaking, that'd probably be something like Deep Thoughts, or you can just double down and just run balance anyways and just use the Ice Fortress for the Minor Protection. Kind of up to you if you want to take that route or not. Next, we have Shivering Shield, which is a really powerful move where it is able to be used. So you absorb up to, in this case, 56.5k damage from 3 projectiles. Every time you absorb a projectile, you get some magicka back, but the main thing is you gain Major Heroism, which gives you 3 ultimate every 1.5 seconds, which is a lot of ultimate. So, for example, in Black Rose Prison, you use Shivering Shield, you're going to get your ultimate up really ridiculously fast. So really powerful move here when you can use it. Doesn't have to be a spell projectiles either, it can be something like an archer, will also proc Shivering Shield. Next we have Frozen Device, which is the Warden version of Chains. It's a little bit clunky to use, so you do have to kind of take good aim with it. It does have a 5 meter radius, so you don't necessarily have to hit the enemy dead on with it. The bonus of this is it deals damage and inflicts major maim on anything that it teleports. So it won't work on bosses, so you don't have a major maim on demand sort of thing, but it does work on ads that you manage to pull in, so it can be quite useful to run this. Under the one hand and shield line, you could run defensive stance if you'd like for the cost reduction to cost of block, as well as the amount of damage you can block, but overall that's not going to be particularly useful there. Under the Destro Staff line, you can run Crushing Shock if you'd like for a ranged interrupt, which might be useful on some fights to get that sort of interrupt off on whatever needs to be interrupted. Under the Heavy Armor line, Unstoppable / Immovable is very nice here. So would most likely be going for the immovable morph rather than the unstoppable brute morph. Both morphs do reduce your movement speed proportional to the amount of heavy armor that you are wearing. So 65 would be the base. Immovable will increase that up to 100 if you are wearing 7 pieces of heavy armor. However, you do happen to get an increase in the amount of damage you can block if you use immovable. So basically, if you wear 7 pieces of heavy armor, you get 35% additional block mitigation, but your movement speed down to 100%. I should say 0%, so you can only move by dodge rolling. So just kind of keep that in mind if you use immovable. But it's a really great option to kind of increase your survivability there. Moving on down the line here to the Fighters Guild line, you have Silver Leash, which is a more immediate form of chains, I should say frozen device. It does use stamina to use, so it's not really ideal, but you could use it in a pinch. Next we have Ring of Preservation, which is a source of minor protection. It has a 5-meter radius, so basically for stack and burn fights and certain execute formations in certain fights, you'll be using Ring of Preservation. It only lasts for 8 seconds, so unfortunately it doesn't last all too long, but it also has a heal associated with it as well, so pretty decent ability to get your hands on. Moving on from there, you have Deep Thoughts, or Introspection, depending which morph you want to take, as an option if you want to combine it with something like Ice Fortress. This basically restores health, magic, and stamina back while you have it channeled. It's a channeled ability though, so you will not be able to block while you are channeling these abilities here. If you have the Deliberation morph passive, you do get major protection, reduces damage by 30%, but it's not quite as much as the block mitigation of 50% plus any sort of additional passives. You could also run a Temporal Guard as your front bar ultimate for the additional amount of protection as well. Under the Unaltered line, just try to make sure to have all of these abilities open. So you have Overflowing Altar for the life steal as well as the Blood Feast synergy, Shadow Soak for the damage synergy, your Inner Rage for your taunt, obviously, Bone Surge for the Spinal Surge synergy, which gives you that major vitality, very useful in fights like Cloud Rest where you have a healing debuff active, Energy Orb for the heal, as well as the Combustion synergy. Now that you can only have one orb out in the time, don't need to spam it anymore, it's actually very easy to kind of sustain Energy Orb, so definitely a good option to hold on to. Under the Alliance War line, Echoing Vigor is a pretty good option if you need sort of an AoE group heal. On the support line, you have Efficient Purge if you need to purge any sort of negative effects here, and then Reviving Barrier if you need a kind of group shield, plus this also gives you, if you have points into it, Magicka 8 passive, which gives you additional Magicka regen. So that is pretty much it for all of the skills. Moving on to our champion point, CP cap is still 810, which gives us 270 CPs to put across each of our different constellation types. Starting off with our green CPs, I do believe I do need to adjust some of these CPs here, I do. So under the Arcanist, 75 into Arcanist and then 49 into Tenacity. That gives us 66 at least into Shadow Ward, and then you can put the remaining points however you'd like. So for example, 40 Tumbling and 40 Warlord is what I personally have on my tanks. You can play around with the green CPs as needed. So for example, you don't necessarily need all these points into Tumbling. You can take them out and put them into Shadow Ward or Tenacity. Kind of play to what you need to do with your green CPs. Under the blue CPs, yep, I definitely need to adjust these. I'm still under my Magicka DPS line here. You're going to want to do 81 into Precise Strikes, 100 into Blessed, 81 into Elfborn, and you have 8 remaining points which you can put basically anywhere you like, so for example 8 into Piercing. So some abilities do scale off of your stamina rather than your Magicka, basically whichever one's highest, so you do want to split them evenly between Elfborn and Precise Strikes, with 100 into Blessed to fully maximize your overall healing done. Finally, our red CPs. This is a kind of balanced approach that gives you very good mitigation across pretty much all pieces of content here. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, and 64 in both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that is pretty much it for all the build informations. Now let's go ahead and talk about the philosophy behind tanking. Your job as a tank is threefold, starting off in terms of priority. First one is obviously to stay alive. A dead tank is a useless tank. Second one is to taunt the boss, or I should say taunt whatever is necessary for you to taunt. That is pretty much what makes a tank. The third job is what separates good tanks from great tanks, and great tanks from awesome tanks. And that's debuff and buff management. This is not just things that proc from your set. So for example, Claws of Yolnahkriin gives you the Minor Courage. So you obviously want to make sure to maintain Minor Courage from that set. But it is also other sort of buffs that you're providing. So things like a Crusher Enchant on your back bar. You try to make sure you have Elemental Blockade down at all times, so that way you're able to proc Crusher reliably. You try to get an orb out to your group at all times. That way they always have some way of activating the combustion synergy once they're off the cooldown. If you're using a Lightning Staff backboard for the Elemental Blockade with the Lightning Staff, you try to keep that up to maximize off-balance uptime on the boss. Being able to maximize your debuffs and your buffs is very important to tanking in ESO. Successful tanks in endgame PvE Trials guilds have very good uptimes on their debuffs. Their Crusher Enchants, their Yolnahkriin, their Warhorn uptimes, they're all really, really good. So again, that third priority there, the managing buffs and debuffs, that is what separates good tanks from great tanks and great tanks from awesome tanks. But the primary thing that you got to do as a tank is really just learn all the mechanics of the fight, because really you are the conductor of the fight. You are the one who sort of controls the flow of the fight here. And success of a Trials group really depends on the success of a tank. A tank that's not able to stay alive, that loses taunt all the time, who doesn't know the mechanics of the fight and is unable to kind of deal with them, that tank is one that is very quickly going to find themselves out of a raid group. So those are kind of your priorities as a tank. Kind of learn how to survive, which is partly learning what the mechanics do and how to deal with the mechanics. So work with your raid lead to kind of figure out what you should do as a tank to kind of deal with certain mechanics. Now, for those of you guys who follow me on Twitch and see my streams on Twitter, or on YouTube I should say, you know that I am a tank main, and so while I typically will tank on my DK, I do have a couple of videos from a Warden tank perspective, so you guys get an idea of how Wardens differ from DKs. The main difference between a Warden tank and a DK tank is the fact that your self-heal is not a burst heal, so Green Dragonblood is a burst heal. Polar Wind has a burst heal associated with it, but it also has a heal over time component associated with it. So you can see here, the instant heal heals me for a little bit, just under 30% of my max health. The additional heal over time over the next 5 seconds gives me another about 6k or so, for a total of about 35 to 40k, 35 to 40% of my max health over 5 seconds. So part of it is learning when to use Polar Wind. You can certainly spam it for that burst heal, so I can just spam it constantly to get that 10.8k health every time. So I just need to use it 3 times and I'd be able to get myself almost all the way back up to full health. But it would basically be wasting magicka. So 3 casts of this would cost me 12k magicka, which is quite a bit of magicka here. So one of the main differences is learning to kind of anticipate damage and use Polar Wind, so that way you have your heal over time going before that big hit comes in, or right after that big hit comes in, you take that Polar Wind and you know how to mitigate the remaining damage, so that way you don't end up getting hit again by something that's pretty nasty before your heal over time has managed to take effect. But beyond that, that's pretty much it. Some real main difference there. The other difference would probably be just to make sure you maintain Netch for the stamina return. But beyond that, tanking pretty much is exactly the same between Dragon Knights and Wardens. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions about tanking or this build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Again, hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.